I'm Sarah,
And I'm Chelsea.
and this is Weathered. We're on and live. We are in the second half of our 1998 tornado story.
Yeah.
Um,
Last week's was a good episode. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to it first.
yes, definitely, because you'll be lost if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is part two. Um, and we got some tough stuff to talk about today. Talk about Dad's firsthand account of the
Yes.
victim of this tornado.
Yeah. Which will be good for, I've heard it sort of, but it'll be good to hear it again because I don't really remember.
Yeah, and I just, we share stories like this really just to bring awareness to the reality of storms and awareness when you're outside, especially, and kind of the things that have been done and been in place to help let us know when things like this are happening or coming. So,
Right.
last time we left off, the tornado was starting to hit Nashville. So, we'd talked about a few of the other ones that had hit Tennessee that day in April of 1998. But now we were getting into the one that actually hit downtown Nashville. It had started over on the west side on Charlotte Avenue and moved into downtown. And as it moved into downtown, it was just busting out the glass of the tall buildings, and it ended up damaging 35 of the high rises downtown.
Which is like all of them at that
Yeah, I
point.
know. Back then in the 90s, yeah, it's like now there's so many more. So
Oh
picture
no.
Nashville circa 98, and there was a
Yeah.
lot less.
Yeah.
I didn't even really think about that. It's true.
Yeah.
So now, as it went through downtown, it's moving across the river into East Nashville. At this time, also, so it's funny because I have on my Music City Miracle t-shirt today.
Oh yeah.
So, but at this time in 98, they were building the new Oilers Stadium.
Oilers.
Yeah, that was right when the Oilers came to town. And it was before they became the Titans.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 10 construction cranes around the stadium, which is so funny because now you look at it and there's probably like 30 cranes.
Oh yeah.
More probably.
Oh my gosh.
But there were 10 around the stadium, and 3 of them were knocked over.
Ugh. That could have been really bad in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Can't believe
then
that only one person.
I know. It is pretty
It's just
crazy,
insane.
especially with all the people that would have been downtown that day.
Yeah.
The tornado continued on over toward Donaldson, and I thought this was a pretty cool little tidbit that I didn't really know. It hit the Cornelia Fort Airport or Airpark, which you may know where that's at. It's like the Shelby Bottoms area in East Nashville.
Yep.
And it's very close to the river. And so if you were at that air park and you just kind of like hopped over the river, you'd be at wave country, like the wave pools.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like so close. And I didn't really know a lot about it, but that's also the airport that Patsy Cline was flying into when her plane crashed and she died.
You know what? I think I knew that.
Did you?
Yeah, I think I knew that.
I did a book report on Patsy Cline when I was a kid.
You know that I remember that?
My book report?
Yes. Swear to God Almighty, I remember you doing that.
Well, you know what's funny is the library actually turned me over to collections for that Patsy Cline book for $7.
I think we still have it, probably.
We ended up paying for it, so it's fine. Yeah, so I didn't really know, I don't think, or at least I'd forgotten that little tidbit of history from that airport.
Yeah.
Which that airport's about 5 miles east of downtown. And I didn't know that the air park was actually named after Nashvilleian Cornelia Fort, who was the
Right.
first female pilot to be killed on war duty in American history.
Really?
Which I know this stuff is not like storm related, but when I read it, I'm like, wow,
I
what a
know that
tough
is really
life.
crazy. I love
Um,
history.
the airport operated until 2011 when it was closed and became part of Shelby Park. So, anyway, I thought that was interesting.
Yes, little tidbits.
The tornado destroyed so much in East Nashville, tons of homes, really old buildings. And the most talked about building that was destroyed is St. Anne's Episcopal Church, which I looked it up because I was like, there's so many old churches over there. I'm not really sure what that is. It was over 100 years old at the time, and it's kind of right there near the First Church of the Nazarene.
Right. Across
There's
the
like,
street?
yeah, so it's on the other
Yeah.
side of the street and then down toward town a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of on the same where that little gas station is.
Yeah.
It's like just down from that. You
Yeah.
wouldn't know it by looking at it. I personally didn't think it was one of those where you would look at it and think, oh, that's been here 100 years. Like it doesn't,
Right.
it's just a brick like church building.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, it's on Woodland Street and now it's like 100 and, I don't know, 150 years old or something. But in 1998, it was almost completely destroyed by that tornado, which was really sad. But the community came together and helped salvage the surviving structure. Took like 2 years for them to start having services there again. But and what's crazy is it's so close to the places that were hit in 2020,
Yeah.
also like on Woodland.
Yeah. I was on Woodland that
Yep.
night.
You were, yeah, that place you were at was on Woodland. And then Tristan's school
Yeah. I was on Gallatin.
that was hit was like just right across, not far from there. So,
And Attaboy was right across from there,
yep.
which is where we'll get into this later. But
Yeah, we'll do the
where
2020 tornado in another episode for sure.
Yeah. Definitely.
All right. So, yeah, poor East Nashville and like Donaldson, I feel like take it really bad when they come through
Yeah.
Nashville.
Every time.
Yep. So, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the one fatality from that day. And to do that, I want to be as respectful as possible to his family, as well as all the first responders from that day. So I'm going to tell this story from our dad's perspective. He was a paramedic and worked for the fire department there in Nashville for 39 years. And he was in Nashville specifically. Well, I say he was a paramedic for 39 years, and he was in Nashville specifically for almost 30, I believe. And I interviewed him to kind of just ask his, it's interesting because I didn't know when I asked him that he was this close to this story. I knew he had to have experienced this day because of his job. But when he told me his story, I was just blown away because I didn't know that he was literally the first group of first responders there that day.
Yes.
And it was interesting because he said that it was a rare, like different kind of day for him because at that time recently he had been working mostly for the police department with their SWAT team. But this day he had been assigned to Medic 20 in Green Hills. And so for those of you who don't know, Green Hills is a suburb of Nashville, very close to downtown and especially pretty close to Vanderbilt University and Centennial Park, where this tragedy happened. So one memory that he has from that day is that he remembered the weather being on every channel all day. He said it was really the first time he remembered that ever happening. Like literally every channel, every show, the weather was on instead.
Right.
So he kind of had that feeling when he saw that and knew something was going to happen. It was just odd.
Well, yeah, especially we hadn't had weather like this before. So we're probably like, obviously he's like, what in the world is happening?
Yeah, it was odd. So he kind of had that feeling like if they're busting into every station.
Channel. Yeah.
Yeah. He was on the AM shift with our uncle. So we mentioned our uncle last time that he was also there with him. So I'm assuming AM shift is kind of like day shift.
Yeah, like 6 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I'm not sure either.
But he was basically daytime. Like I think he did say that his relief came in at 6 p.m. So it might be more of like
Okay.
a 6 a to 6 p. He said that he'd been around back of the building, sort of straightening up his work car. Because, if they're not on a call, he was kind of just like organizing his car because it had gotten messy with what he was doing the day before. So he vividly remembers going from the back of the building and walking to the front of the building and looking out to just see a giant wall of darkness. And he was like, oh, dear, that looks like a storm coming.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure the timing on this, but I imagine it was somewhere around 3:30. And he said all of a sudden, like he saw that dark sky, and all of a sudden they dispatched a ton of fire and ambulances to Centennial Park. So none of the first responders knew it was a tornado at this point. So they just knew that
Insane.
it was a big call to Centennial Park.
Yeah.
Another crazy thing that happened was the Green Hills squad were the first to get to the scene.
Which I think
And
is so weird. If you're from Nashville, you would know that there are closer stations.
yeah, and basically, yeah, that one was not the closest to the park.
No.
And there's one on the west side that is closer. But if you look at the track of the tornado, the Green Hill station is a little south below the path that the tornado took.
Yeah.
So I think probably what happened, this is just speculation, but it ended up, they found out later that the other trucks couldn't get there because of the debris in the road and everything.
Got it. That makes
And so I
sense.
think that it just so happened that the path the tornado took, their station was south of that, and they were able to just kind of hop over there and
Yeah.
didn't run into any issues on the
It,
way.
right.
So anyway, Dad's truck was the first on the scene. He said when they arrived, they had no idea what they were walking into. They didn't know what the call was. So, they just get there like, all right, let's figure this out. And he said when they pulled up, people started waving them over, like, come over here. This is where the problem is. And Parks and Recreation had already gotten there. So
Yes.
Parks and Rec actually, and I don't know if it's still there, but they had like a building that was basically connected to the park where they kept lots of their supplies and tools, etc., for Parks and Rec. So they were there, and they had actually just like ran over to try to help, and may have been the ones that called 911. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And they had actually brought over chainsaws because they had all these. They're Parks and Rec. They
Yeah.
had all these
Sure. Yeah.
tools,
They're like, what can
um,
we do?
because the situation was involving a tree, and so they were like, "Oh, let us try to help." They brought some tools over. Dad said that when he walked up on the scene, it was really chaotic and no one knew what to do, right? Like there was people there was Parks and Rec there, but no one knew what to do. So he rushed up and took control of the situation and started just like telling people what to do.
Delegating.
Yep. So turns out a large tree had injured a Vanderbilt student. His name is Kevin Longanati. I hope I said that right. Who was at the park on an ROTC outing that day. So let's pause for just a second and talk about Kevin. He was a very smart and compassionate Tennessean from Memphis. He was actually about to graduate from Vanderbilt that year, 1998. So this was in April.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. May would have been when I just got chilled up.
I know. And Dad, when I was talking to Dad about this story, this really bothered him. Like that this happened to this boy.
Yeah.
Man, but boy.
Yeah.
He was set to graduate cum laude with a major in mathematics,
Whoa.
special education, and special disabilities in children.
Oh my gosh,
He had
what a
dreams of
good
joining the
guy.
army to serve, as well as eventually get a doctorate and work with disabled children.
Oh my gosh, what an
Yeah,
angel.
he sounds like such an amazing person. And it
Yeah,
makes it like, not that we
makes
want
it
people to suffer this, but
sure.
it
I
just makes
know.
it worse. He had such a bright future ahead of him, and that's something Dad mentioned too. Like, it's extremely unfortunate that at this time there really was no warning for these kids. So smartphones didn't exist. There were no sirens outdoors in the area, and the
So
weather,
crazy.
I know, and the weather had seemed fine until it wasn't.
Yeah,
They were out
happens
there
so
just,
fast.
mhm. So back to the scene. Dad said that when he got there, Kevin was awake and talking. And there's also some misconception about what actually happened, because Dad was saying that that was something that was kind of frustrating for him, is you would see a lot of these stories that would say like a tree fell on him, but that's actually not exactly what happened. So basically, according to the witnesses like Dad, who were actually there,
Yeah.
said that basically this tree that they were, I guess they were kind of like beside this tree or under it for their outing and hanging out. He said that the stump of this tree was at least 6 feet around. He said
Oh
it
my
was
gosh.
gigantic. And he remembers that they were told that Kevin was actually standing under the tree and that the wind caused a huge branch, which was basically the size of
The
a
sides of a
normal
tree.
tree. Yeah. Um, to fall on him. But it didn't exactly fall on him. So when it fell, it sort of brushed against his belly, causing him to fall down in sort of an upright seated position. So imagine that, like, it kind of hits you in the front and it
Right.
knocks you down to sitting. And when that happened, the limb completely crushed his legs,
Yeah.
and the pieces of it. So I'm trying to describe this because it's a podcast and people are just listening. But so when the limb broke off the tree, the limb itself landed on his legs, but the pieces that had
Hmm.
broken from the tree were poking into his abdomen and like the front.
Right.
So Dad took one look at it, immediately knew that when they attempted to move that limb, it was not going to be
It
good.
was right.
So he said he instructed the others to grab the supplies to be ready to start IVs, etc., for when that happened.
Mhm.
So, there are actually pictures of this happening, which I'll post on the blog post for this episode. But um, I found them as I was researching for this episode. And when I showed them to Dad, he couldn't believe it. He'd never seen those pictures. He's like, "Where did you find those?" I was like,
The
they
internet.
actually were posted on a post from the news channel that was like a anniversary article years later. So I'm not really
Yeah.
sure if maybe that's why he'd never seen them, but he was like, that's me right there. And you can't see his face, but you can see like his helmet with the number on it and everything. And he was like, yeah, that's me. Um, he is holding in the picture, Dad is holding an oxygen mask over Kevin's mouth and nose while he's still sitting in the upright position. It's pretty horrifying to see.
Hmm.
And they would find out later that besides his legs being completely crushed, his diaphragm had been ruptured and most of his abdominal organs were just like pushed.
Yeah.
And, you know, in what we know in situations like this is even with like stabbings and stuff like that, sometimes when you dislodge what's kind of
Yeah.
holding you together, it's just
Yeah.
everything's gone after that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I've
so I was
seen a
trying
lot
to
of
figure,
Grey's Anatomy.
yeah, just not so realistic sometimes. But so turns out that Parks and Rec actually had a very old, like wrecker type vehicle that had been donated to them from the army or something like that. And so they went to go get it because that was the only way that they were going to get this limb lifted off of him and extracted
Yeah.
off because it was so big. So they did. They went and got that, brought it over. And once they lifted the limb and laid him down on the ground, he lost consciousness immediately.
Oh, yeah.
At that point, Dad said that they immediately started bagging him. So, pushing air to try to help him breathe. And they were also able to get his blood pressure back up. And he said at that point, he woke up and started talking to them again. And that's when they got him loaded up to rush him over to Vanderbilt's ER, which was like right across the road.
Yeah.
By this point, they still didn't know that a tornado had hit. They didn't know.
Insane.
I know. They dropped Kevin off at the emergency room, and as they began driving back to the station is when they realized what had happened.
Yeah.
He said there was so much debris in the roads that they had an awful time trying to get back. And that's when they saw all the glass blown out of the tall buildings around town. And they were like, whoa, like a storm came through, obviously.
Yeah.
What the heck? So they all went back to the station, and at 6 p.m., their relief got there. And that was it. Moving on for Dad, right? So we were talking about like how hard that must be for first responders. Like,
yeah,
you
just basically went there. You try to save this guy's life. You do the best you can in that situation. And then you just drop him off and you're like, am I ever going to know like what really happened after that? It's like,
yeah,
you can't help but be emotionally invested into this. And, we've talked about this a lot about our dad and stuff, but like the trauma that comes along with these first responders on these calls is just, a lot.
And in that situation, he literally just had to stuff it and move on, because he said that when at 6 o'clock, when he got off there, he went straight to his work at the police department all night.
Oh.
And so he said he spent the whole night doing welfare checks in East Nashville with the police department, because East Nashville had been hit really hard. And he was basically working like security detail to stop looting, because people had already started looting.
Oh my God. I didn't even think about that.
So you're like, okay, let me just like walk away from this horrible traumatic scene that I just left and put on my police hat and go like stop these idiots from looting.
Stealing.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Kevin ended up passing away from his injuries a few weeks later. And, I really wanted to tell Dad's story and truly Kevin's story, like, just so we can hear them and remember how important weather awareness and safety is. So before we move on, I just wanted to share some of the amazing work that Kevin's mom has actually done to make change after this tragedy. So I didn't know this either, but at the time, the only sirens in Nashville were installed in the 60s and were meant to alert people of a Cold War type attack.
Yeah.
And those sirens did not sound that day in 1998, even though they were said to have been an option for tornadoes. So Kevin's mom sued Metro for not sounding the sirens that day. And Metro basically responded and said, well, they should have had an NOAA, which is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration weather radio, which is what we have. But yeah, okay.
They were outside.
I mean, they make them that are like walkie-talkies, but still, like, okay, everyone's not just going to carry one of those around all the time. Yeah.
No.
So she kept pushing, and she was able to get sirens installed on Vandy's campus, as well as continuing to push the conversation with government officials to install them in urban areas across the state. And over the years since then, more and more sirens have been installed, but there's still ongoing debate over whether those are the most useful way to save lives, especially with technological advances in weather prediction and alert systems. And, I'll share a little bit more about sirens on a separate episode, because there's just been a lot of continued work on educating people about sirens. A lot of people think that, well, if I have a siren near my house, then I'm safe. But really, you shouldn't depend on those solely, right? But they still have their place. So, but still, her hard work should be commended, and positive work that's happened in Kevin's honor. So, kudos to Kevin's mom for pushing for something positive and to help prevent, hopefully, situations like that from happening again the best she can.
Well,
So, as we said earlier, Dad had recalled the weather being on every TV channel all day. And the meteorologists in Nashville that day were determined to warn people. It's really frustrating to me still, the way people talk about and talk to meteorologists. Like, if you go on the National Weather Service's Facebook pages, the people's comments are just
Oh, what are they
like,
saying?
it's just like they expect meteorologists to get it right every single
To
time.
be
And I'm
God?
sorry, but this is Mother Nature.
Yeah. She's
You're,
much bigger than we are.
yeah, you're not going to get it every time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they work really hard and they work long hours. And, the weather is just not something that can be perfectly predicted, but they do their best. And so in Nashville that day, Chris Clark, so it's funny because I hear these names and I'm like, I vaguely remember we were
Brings
kids.
back some nostalgia.
Yeah. Chris Clark, who was on CBS News Channel 5 at the time, even so, they lost audio at the TV station when the tornado hit their building. So this dude got like a whiteboard and like drug it in front of the camera and started writing with a black marker
Yeah.
so that he
Good
could
for
still,
him.
yeah. And like the whole news channel's like run into the basement and he's like, no, I'm going to keep writing and trying to warn people.
Oh,
And there's
buddy.
actually, so he was like the newscaster, and then there was a meteorologist. His name was Ron Howes, and he was on there at the time. And there's actually a really great interview you can watch of the two of them like reminiscing about that day. And I'll link that one too when I post about this episode. But he talks about how at the time, I didn't even think about this either. It really wasn't a thing for the weather to be on every newscast. So now the weather has a segment
Yeah.
every time. And then you've got the Weather
Yeah.
Channel who's busting in like every
All the
hour.
time. Yeah.
Um, but so he said, over the years, as they started to realize how important it was, then meteorologists were brought in for every newscast. But he happened to be
Yeah.
there that day for that. So, but
Oh,
it's a
Lord.
funny interview to hear. And there's like a video you can find, I think it's on YouTube, of all of them standing at the door, like of the building, and they've got the
Yeah.
cameras and
I'm assuming it's in the same place that it is now, was in the same place that it is now, which is downtown on
yeah, right smack in the
like,
middle of all the action.
yeah. Oh my gosh. That's so funny.
Yeah, so it's funny because a lot of like people remember that day and like the newscasters writing on the whiteboard with no audio.
Right. I'm gonna go
Um,
definitely watch that interview of them talking about it.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, that's pretty much the story of that tornado that day. It ended up traveling 42 miles. So it took that same trek that we've talked about before, where it landed in West Nashville, went through downtown, through East Nashville, Donaldson, Wilson County, and then it ended up finally lifting when it got to Hartsville. So
Good.
that's pretty far. It's not
Yeah,
quite
it
as
is.
far. 2020 ended up going like all the way to Cookeville, but this
Yeah.
one, Hartsville's pretty far.
Yeah.
And so to recap, that day there were 13 tornadoes in Tennessee, with the worst being that forgotten F5 that was actually south of Nashville and
Which
has
is
kind
so
of,
crazy to think that I think if I recall correctly, it's like the only F5,
yeah.
which is so crazy that like an F3 and an F4. I mean, F5 must be like
Yeah, because we see F3s and
so
F4s.
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. Yeah. The
And so
forgotten
those,
tornado.
yep, the forgotten, because I guess, Nashville just kind of overshadowed it,
Yeah.
the media. But those 13 tornadoes hit 15 different counties and killed 4 people total while injuring nearly 100 and
Yeah.
just destroying all kinds of things. So, yeah, that's the story of a
Oh.
tornado that turned us into weather preparedness people.
Yeah. The first tornado that I can experience, and you weren't here for it, but it had impact all the same on you.
Yeah.
So,
And it's wild how these storms have like a ripple effect of generations, and
mm-hmm.
they might destroy these things, but they live on for years and years, and people are usually
Yeah.
cleaning up the mess, and they cost a lot of money. And
Yeah, that's like just a tidbit of information, but in 2020, West Wilson Middle School, or I think it was West Wilson, was like just really, really destroyed.
yeah.
Um, and the like grand opening is this week.
Oh,
The
really?
school, yeah. So 4 years later, the
2024.
school is now back open.
Wow.
Yep,
It's
which is
looking really,
insane because it was gone, and then we've watched it be built, and it was just a closed down school for a long time, and now it's open.
that's wild.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking really gloomy and windy out right now.
Oh, well, it
So
is a
hopefully
beautiful
we're not
day
getting,
here in Nashville. Yeah, you're in the new tornado alley.
I know. I posted that link of the Weather Channel. They have a new
Uh-huh.
study that shows that the alley has actually shifted, and we all knew that, right? And we
Of
live there.
course.
We're like, we
Yeah.
know. But anyway, so yeah, that's the story of the 98 tornado, and um pretty crazy story of the firsthand account from our dad. But
Yeah.
we'll in future episodes, maybe next episode, I can try to do some just like science. We can skip like an actual story and do some, maybe talk about the science of tornadoes, or like
Yeah.
warnings, watches, and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And then our this podcast won't be all tornadoes, but
Yeah.
um starting off with some of those. We'll also look at some hurricanes, blizzards, stuff like that. And I mean, really, you can look at different types of storms. I mean, severe thunderstorms can be just as bad as tornadoes sometimes, even though
Yeah,
they
for
don't hit
sure.
the hype. So anyway, yep,
Cool. Well, that was a fun one considering, well, it wasn't fun, but it was a fun one considering we had like firsthand experience with it. So,
totally.
yeah,
All right, well,
cool.
tell them where they can find us.
I don't know why whenever you do this, I'm always like, oh gosh, do I remember what it is? Um, you can find us on Instagram at Weathered Podcast. You can find us on TikTok at Weathered Pod, Pod. And then you can also email us your firsthand experiences if you hear something that you know a little bit about, or if you have your own storm that you're like, you should do this one. Great. You can email us at weatheredpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, I can't wait to read some stories on the podcast so we can hear your
Yeah.
firsthand accounts.
Yeah, it's going to be cool. And then maybe we can have some of you on here one day if you have some firsthand experience.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well,
Cool.
till next time, stay weather aware.
See you later.
Bye.